The wind came crawling off the high plains, low and mournful, dragging the scent of dust and rain that would never fall. The land was stretched thin beneath a pewter sky, its grasses beaten pale by drought, and the endless hooves of passing herds. Against that lonely horizon rode a man so large the saddle looked carved for a beast of burden, not a man. His hat shadowed half his face, his eyes two cold marbles that caught no light. Folks in town called him the Giant Cowboy, though no one spoke the name to his face. They said he had once killed a man with his bare hands, snapped his neck like a dry twig over a fence post, and that his silence afterward had been the truest confession. Clay Reddin had stopped speaking much since the fire. A man's voice could echo too long in his head when the only thing answering it was memory. He lived on the edge of town now, past the broken windmill and the old riverbed that hadn't seen water in 3 years. His land was hardpan and scrub, his cattle thin, and his house little more than gray boards with a roof that sagged like tired shoulders. But the quiet suited him. He needed no one, or so he told himself when the nights stretched too long and the bottle ran empty. That morning, the wind carried something new, a stagecoach rattling over the ridge road, its wheels shrieking like frightened birds. He paused in the field, one hand on the fence post, and watched it move through the dust. It stopped at the depot across town, and through the gray haze he saw a figure step down, a woman in a travel-stained dress, a small trunk in her hands. She looked lost. The driver tipped his hat, cracked the reins, and left her standing there in the wind. Her name, though he didn't know it yet, was Anna Whitlow. She had come farther than any map could tell, fleeing a city that had turned cold on her after her husband died, leaving debts and whispers. Her brother had written from this place, promising work and a roof, but when she arrived, there was no one waiting. The depot clerk shrugged and turned away. The boarding house refused to extend credit. The church was locked. By afternoon, the dust clung to her like shame. Clay saw her again 2 days later, walking along the road toward his land, her boots torn, her skirts heavy with grit. She carried the trunk, no longer left it somewhere, maybe traded it for food. The sun burned white overhead. She stumbled once, twice, and then stopped, pressing her hand to her throat as if to hold in a sob. He could have turned away. He almost did. But the sight of her small, defiant, trembling stirred something in the hollowed-out chambers of his chest. He led his horse down the fence line until he reached her. "You lost," he said, his voice dry from disuse. She looked up, startled by the size of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the way the light seemed to bend around him. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He dismounted, boots sinking into the dust, and offered her his canteen. She hesitated, then drank greedily, water running down her chin. "I was told my brother lived near here," she said finally. "James Whitlow. You might know him." He shook his head. "Ain't no Whitlow I know." She looked past him, at the land stretching out to nothing. "Then I came all this way for nothing." Something inside him shifted then, a slow cracking like ice breaking on a river. "You can rest at my place a while," he said. "Ain't much, but there's shade." She blinked at him, uncertain whether to trust the giant whose name men spoke in whispers. But the heat left her no choice. She followed him through the gate, her steps small and uneven beside his long stride. Inside the house, the air smelled of dust and old wood. He poured her a tin cup of water, set it on the table without a word. She sat, hands trembling around it. Her eyes roamed the bare walls, the single chair, the cot in the corner. "You live alone?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Always." She didn't ask what had emptied his life so completely. She didn't need to. The silence in the room spoke for him, the burned edges of an old photograph on the mantel, the blackened ring on the floor where fire once took something precious. That night, the wind howled through the cracks, and he lay awake, listening to her quiet breathing from the cot. The sound filled the room like prayer. For the first time in years, Clay Reddin did not dream of fire. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder grumbled like a warning or a promise. The next morning broke pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself doubted the worth of rising. Mist lay over the grasslands like ghost breath, and the world seemed still enough to hear the slow creak of the barn door as Clay pushed it open. Inside, the mare snorted softly, her flanks streaked with sweat. He worked in silence, pitching hay, his every movement deliberate, as though he feared the day might splinter under too much noise. Anna stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his old coats, sleeves swallowing her wrists. Her hair, once neat and city-tidy, had come undone, a spill of honey-colored strands catching the first light. He turned when he sensed her there but said nothing. She stepped closer, her boots uncertain on the packed dirt floor. "I should go into town," she said, voice thin but steadier than he expected. "There might be work." He wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced toward the distant ridge, where the town still slept beneath a smudge of smoke. "Ain't much to find," he said. "Men work the freight lines, women wash or cook for the saloon. Both kinds get used up fast." Her chin lifted. "I can cook, so I'll manage." He looked at her then, not as a burden left by fate, but as someone still fighting to stand upright against the wind. "You'll need a horse," he said, reaching for the tack wall. "Take Buck, he's steady." "I can walk," she answered quickly. "I owe you already." "You don't owe me," he said. But his voice caught a little, gravel catching on gravel. "Just take the horse." She hesitated, then nodded. When she rode away through the fog, her figure blurred into the horizon like something imagined. Clay watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then turned back to the emptiness of the barn. It felt colder than before. By noon she was back, dust coating her face and hair. "They said there's no Whitlow in town," she murmured, eyes downcast. "The clerk at the depot swore my brother never lived here." He nodded, unsurprised. "People vanish easy out here." She dropped onto the porch steps, exhaustion dragging her shoulders low. "He was all I had left," she whispered. "I sold my wedding ring for the ticket west." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of flies and the creak of the windmill. Clay sat beside her, his broad hands resting on his knees. "You can stay till you figure your road," he said finally. "Plenty of work needs doing here." And so she stayed. Days passed like wind, through dry grass, slow, relentless. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the corral gate, the hiss of coffee boiling over the stove. She scrubbed, mended, cooked what little there was. In return, Clay taught her how to mend a fence line, how to patch a saddle, how to listen for storms long before the clouds showed. Sometimes he'd catch her staring at the horizon, her eyes reflecting distances too far for any man to measure. He never asked what she saw there. He knew what it meant to look for ghosts. One evening, when the sun melted into gold along the prairie edge, Anna brought out an old quilt she'd found in a trunk. "It's half finished," she said, spreading it across her knees. "Looks like someone gave up before the last square." Clay looked at it, a patchwork of faded blues and browns, bits of shirts and dresses. He reached out, touching the cloth lightly. "My mother's," he said. "She used to sew nights after the chores. Stopped the day my father didn't come back from the drive." She nodded, running her fingers along a crooked seam. "Maybe I could finish it, if you'd let me." He studied her face, earnest, unassuming, full of something he'd almost forgotten, gentleness without pity. "If you've a mind to," he said. When she smiled, it was small but sure, like dawn coming over the ridge. For the first time in years, the house felt less like a tomb and more like shelter. Weeks turned into a kind of rhythm. She laughed sometimes, quietly, the sound startling in its brightness. Once, when a calf got caught in a fence, she ran into the field beside him, skirts flying, face flushed with effort. Together they freed the frightened animal, and when it bolted away, they stood shoulder to shoulder, breathless, sharing a laugh that came from someplace deep and forgotten. That night, after she'd gone to her cot, Clay sat by the window, the moon whitening the plains outside. He thought of her voice, the way she moved through his days, now softening their edges. Something inside him trembled like a rope stretched too long under strain. He didn't name it. Out here, words could ruin a fragile thing before it had the chance to live. Outside, coyotes cried in the distance. The world was still cruel, but the wind had changed. Autumn came slow to the plains, a whisper more than a turning. The air sharpened, nights longer, the light thinning over the grass, until everything seemed carved from old brass. The cattle moved restless, noses to the wind, sensing a winter not far off. Clay worked longer hours, fixing fence lines and hauling feed before the ground turned to stone. Anna stayed close to the house, tending what garden still clung to life, mending the quilt piece by piece in the glow of lamplight. In the evenings they shared quiet suppers, beans, cornbread, sometimes jerky from the smokehouse. Conversation was spare but honest. The words they did speak carried weight. Each one built a bridge across that silent chasm between them. One night, as frost laced the window, she said, "You could sell some of the land, Clay. It's too much for one man to hold." He didn't look up from his plate. "Was my father's before it was mine. Ain't much, but it's what's left of him." She smiled faintly. "You speak of him like he's still here." He raised his eyes to her, then gray, worn, uncertain. "Sometimes feels that way. When the wind comes down off the ridge, I swear I hear his boots in the dirt." She nodded, eyes softening. "Grief doesn't leave. It just learns new names." He studied her for a long moment, then reached for the coffee pot. "You talk like someone who knows." "I do," she whispered. "My husband, Thomas. He wasn't cruel, just weak. Lost our savings gambling, left me to face the shame. He wrote once, begging forgiveness. I burned the letter. After that, I suppose I burned most everything good in me, too." Clay's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something comfort, maybe, but the right words never came. He had buried too many. Instead, he poured her coffee and slid the cup across the table. She met his gaze, a faint smile flickering there, something like gratitude. Days passed, marked by small mercies. The first snow fell, early soft flakes drifting down on the empty fields. Clay woke to find her outside, face lifted to the sky, laughter spilling out like something newly born. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching. She turned, eyes bright. "I've never seen it like this," she said. "It feels like the world forgives itself for a little while." He stepped into the yard beside her. "Don't last long. Nothing good does out here." She looked up at him, her voice quiet but sure. "Then we take what we can while it lasts." He didn't answer, but the words settled deep in him, like a seed finding soil. Later that week, a wagon came down the road, a merchant from the next county, big man with a red beard and a habit of looking too long at what wasn't his. He brought supplies, traded for beef and hides. When his eyes lingered on Anna, Clay felt something tighten in his chest, old and dangerous. "Didn't know you took on help," the merchant said, grinning. "Pretty thing like her must brighten the place up." Clay's voice was calm, low. "She's my guest. That's all you need to know." The man laughed, glancing between them. "Guest, sure. Folks'll talk, you know. A widower and a lady all alone, under one roof." Before he could finish, Clay's hand shot out, gripping the man's collar. The grin vanished. "You done?" Clay asked softly. The merchant swallowed hard, nodding. When Clay let go, the man climbed back into his wagon and left without another word, dust rising behind him like smoke. That evening, Anna stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "He was out of line." "Yes, but you gave him power by rising to it. Folks talk more when they smell blood." He turned away, shame prickling under his skin. "I don't care what folks say." She stepped closer. "But I do. I've lived with whispers, Clay. They can ruin a life faster than a bullet." He met her eyes then, anger giving way to something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or sorrow. "I just didn't want him thinking he could touch what ain't his." Her breath caught. "And what am I then? Yours?" He froze, the question hanging between them like a taut rope. She turned away before he could answer, retreating into the shadows of the house. The wind outside rose, rattling the windows, and he stood there long after she was gone, his hands trembling at his sides. That night, sleep would not come. He sat by the dying fire, watching the embers fade to ash. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled a sound raw and lonely enough to break a heart already cracked. He thought of her upstairs, thought of the warmth she'd brought to a place long dead. And for the first time in years, he prayed not for forgiveness, but for courage. The next morning dawned gray, a thin drizzle veiling the horizon. The fields lay soaked and heavy, every blade bending under the weight of water. Clay woke to the smell of wet earth and cold air leaking through the cracks in the boards. The house was still. Anna's door stood open, her cot neatly made, the quilt folded across it. For a moment, panic flared in him like a struck match. Then he saw her outside, near the corral, sleeves rolled to the elbow, scrubbing a saddle blanket in a tin basin. He stepped out quietly, boots sinking into mud. "You'll freeze out here," he said. She didn't look up. "I've worked through worse." Her tone was even, but there was distance in it like a gate he couldn't open. He hesitated, then said, "About yesterday." "Don't," she interrupted, voice low. "We both said more than we meant." He wanted to protest, to tell her that he hadn't meant to claim her, only to protect her, but words never seemed to carry what lived in his chest. So he said nothing, just stood watching as she wrung out the cloth, her fingers red from the cold water. Days passed in that uneasy quiet. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were polite, measured. The warmth that had filled the house seemed to fade with the light, leaving only echoes of what had almost been. Clay threw himself into work, cutting firewood until his hands split and bled. But even the ache of labor could not drown the thought of her silence. One evening, after supper, she found him out by the barn, oiling the saddle leather by lantern glow. "Clay," she said softly, "I've decided to go." The world seemed to still. "Go where?" "There's a widowed teacher in town, Mrs. Thorne. She needs help running her school. It isn't much, but it's honest work." He set the rag down slowly. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. "But staying here isn't fair to either of us." The rain began again, tapping against the barn roof like slow tears. He wanted to tell her to stay, to say that the house would die without her laughter, that he couldn't bear the quiet again, but pride held him silent. He only nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. The next morning she packed what little she owned. He saddled Buck for her, tightening the cinch with hands that trembled despite his will. When she stepped onto the porch, dressed in the blue shawl he'd found for her in town, he nearly lost his composure. "You'll be safe there," he said, voice thick. She gave a small nod. "Thank you, Clay, for everything." He wanted to reach for her hand, but she was already turning, leading the horse toward the road. The wind rose, carrying her scent soap, smoke, and something softer, something that would haunt him long after she was gone. He watched her ride away until she vanished into the gray distance, swallowed by the same horizon that had once brought her to him. Then he went back inside, the emptiness pressing down like a physical weight. For weeks, the world seemed smaller, colder. He worked until dark, slept without dreaming, spoke to no one. But news travels even across lonely miles. One afternoon, a rider came tearing down the road, a boy from town, breathless and wild-eyed. "Mr. Reddin," he shouted, "they're saying Mrs. Thorne's place caught fire last night. Miss Whitlow, she went back in for one of the children. They don't know if she made it." Clay didn't wait for another word. He was on his horse before the boy could finish, spurring hard toward town, the wind screaming past his ears. The world blurred around him, mud, sky, smoke rising in the distance like a wound torn open to the heavens. When he reached the schoolhouse, it was little more than a blackened shell, the roof caved in, the air thick with the stench of charred wood and sorrow. Townsfolk stood in clusters, faces pale. A woman wept into her apron. Clay dismounted, shoving through the crowd. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Inside," someone whispered. "They found her near the back. She was shielding one of the little ones." He pushed past the sheriff, ignoring the hand that tried to stop him, and stepped into the ruin. The smoke clawed at his throat, the heat still biting through the ashes. There, amid the wreckage, he saw her curled on her side, soot streaked across her face, hair tangled and singed. But when he dropped to his knees beside her, her chest rose, faint but real. "Anna," he whispered, voice breaking, "don't you go now. Don't you dare." Her eyes fluttered open, finding him through the haze. "The children?" she rasped. "They're safe," he said. "You got them out." She tried to smile, but the effort broke into a cough. He lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest, and carried her out into the rain. The townspeople stepped back, watching the giant cowboy move through the smoke, his face streaked with tears and soot. For the first time in years, he was not alone, and he would not be again. He stayed by her side through the long nights that followed. The doctor worked what skill he had: bandages, tinctures, whispered prayers, but in the end, it was time and will that healed her more than any hand. Clay sat by the bed, sleepless, his frame too large for the chair but unwilling to move. He watched her breathe, slow and shallow, as if every breath were borrowed from some distant mercy. Outside, rain turned to snow, coating the burned earth in pale forgiveness. By the third night she stirred. Her hand, pale and trembling, reached for him. "You should rest," she whispered. He shook his head. "Been resting too long most my life." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "The town, are they angry? About the fire?" He looked toward the window, where lanterns flickered faintly beyond the glass. "No, they call you a hero." Her eyes filled with tears. "I only did what anyone would." "Not anyone," he said quietly. "Not most." She looked at him for a long time then, as though seeing him fully for the first time, not just the size or the silence, but the gentleness behind it. "You came for me," she said softly. He nodded, unable to speak. Weeks passed, and winter deepened. The snow lay heavy across the plains, turning every sound to silence. The townspeople, once wary of the Giant Cowboy, began to greet him when he came for supplies. They'd seen what he carried out of the fire, seen the care in his hands. Word spread that maybe Clay Reddin wasn't the beast folks said he was. Maybe he was just a man who'd lost too much and learned to keep quiet. When Anna was strong enough to walk again, he brought her back to the ranch. The house was as they'd left it, except for the quilt folded neatly on the bed, finished now, every square stitched with patience and grace. She ran her fingers over the seams, tracing the work she had once begun for him. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He shrugged, suddenly shy. "Didn't want it left undone." Her eyes softened. "Then it's ours." The days returned to rhythm, but different now, gentler, shared. She took to reading aloud in the evenings, her voice soft against the crackle of fire. He listened without speaking, content just to let the sound fill the spaces that had once been empty. Sometimes she'd glance up to find him watching her with that quiet, steady gaze, and though he said nothing, she felt everything he meant. One morning, the thaw began. Water trickled through the dry beds, softening the earth. Clay saddled the mare while she packed a basket with bread and coffee. They rode out beyond the ridge, where the land opened into miles of open sky. The wind was clean, the air smelling of promise. "Never thought I'd see the river run again," he said. She smiled, eyes bright in the sunlight. "Maybe it just needed patience." They stopped where the ground rose into a low hill. From there, the whole valley spread before them, their land, their solitude, their small corner of forgiveness. She looked out across it all and said, "It's strange. The first time I came here, it felt like the edge of the world. Now it feels like the beginning." He turned to her, hat in his hands, voice low. "Anna, I don't know much about promises, but if you'll have me, I'd like to build something here with you." Her answer came not in words, but in the way she reached up, touched his face, and smiled through tears. "You already have, Clay. You just didn't see it." He bent his head, and their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the cold air. The world around them was vast and empty, yet somehow, in that moment, it felt full. Spring came early that year. The grass rose green again, and wildflowers pressed through the soil as though drawn by some invisible vow. Together they rebuilt what had burned: the barn, the fences, the faith between them. In the evenings, neighbors sometimes stopped by, bringing pie or gossip, laughter echoing through the yard. And though Clay never said much, he was there, always beside her, his silence no longer the language of grief, but of peace. On the day the first foal was born, Anna stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm as the tiny creature wobbled into the light. "You think it'll make it?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It's got good blood, and a reason to try." She smiled, leaning into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "We all do, don't we?" He looked down at her, eyes soft, the years of loneliness melting into something warmer. "We do now." The wind moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain and the sound of laughter from the house. The sky stretched wide and forgiving, the color of dawn after a long night. Clay Reddin took her hand. The giant cowboy, once feared and alone, stood there with the woman who had walked through fire to find him, both of them marked by loss, yet remade by grace. And for the first time in a long, long while, the land felt alive. The river kept running. The fields breathed again. And inside the little house on the hill, two hearts beat steady, unafraid of silence.